Thanks for inviting me. So I'm with the Department of Computer Science at the University of Idaho. So I come at evolution from sort of an engineering perspective, which is a bit odd, I suppose, but that's sort of the idea here is one way we can think about evolution, there's the biological sense. There's also the idea maybe that we can apply it. Right? So not only understand it, but also take advantage of it. Being from computer science, I'm sort of very in favor, I guess, of computers. So one of the things I've done is put up a website here. This has one of the little games that I developed to sort of illustrate evolution. It's not nearly as sophisticated as, say, the Vita Ed. It's sort of more aimed for middle school students, but a good place to start. So if you happen to have a laptop or a tablet, or actually I think it will even run on a smartphone and you want to check it out, please feel free to go ahead. I don't mind people pulling out their computers. And I'll demonstrate it in a little bit, but I thought I'd get started there in case anybody wants to jump ahead. So from an engineering perspective, the term that often gets used is evolutionary computation, and it generally is sort of lumped in with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And the idea is to use analogs of natural evolution to evolve solutions, and that's a very vague term, right? Evolve solutions. I'll talk about what I mean in a minute, but the idea is you have a population of potential solutions. So instead of a population of biological organisms, you have a population of solutions to some problem, or at least potential solutions. And then you take those solutions, those individuals, and you measure how good they are, and you assign them a fitness. And initially, they tend to be terrible. But some of them will be slightly less terrible, and then you can select the slightly less terrible ones, and then you can do heritability and variation and apply it to those slightly less terrible solutions. And hopefully, if you repeat this over and over again, you get pretty good solutions. And so it's sort of an optimization process or a search process or a learning process. You can think about it those ways. And so this is sort of, again, a computer scientist's very abstract notion of evolution. I'll run through it because it gives a sense of what the examples I showed do. So we sort of think of ourselves as starting with a population, like I say, of potential solutions. So here I've drawn 5 just using colors, but really we might have 500 or 5,000, or if you've got a lot of computing power, 50,000 sort of potential solutions to some problem. And initially they're all random and pretty terrible, but we can see how terrible they are and assign them a fitness, and then again, sort of select the ones that are slightly less terrible and do some sort of crossover mutation on them, so they'll swap the pieces a little bit, and then put them back into the population and repeat. And so this is a sort of standard evolutionary computation algorithm. This is what's referred to as a steady state model. You have one population and you keep taking individuals out and putting them back in. Okay? And if there are questions along the way, I should have said this at the beginning, if there are questions along the way, please raise your hand and interrupt. And then the other model that's often used is the same idea, but is more generationally oriented. So again, we have a population of potential solutions and select the better ones, do some sort of crossover mutation, put them in a new population, repeat that until it's full, and then start over again. And it can be a fairly slow process, but if you've got a lot of computing power, you can sort of evolve all sorts of different kinds of solutions. And so what do I mean? I'm, again, being sort of very vague about these potential solutions. And the way to think about it is if this is all taking place on a computer, then in a sense, anything you can represent on a computer, you can apply this to. And so people talk a lot about different representations. From a computer science perspective, everything on a computer is a binary string, so anything you represent on a computer, you can say, well, it's a binary string, and I'm going to pick the better binary strings. It turns out that often that's really slow, and so you might represent your solutions as a set of numbers, but it could also be the design of an organism, right? So that was sort of the walking we saw earlier. There's a lot of work actually evolving equations. So this is a little equation, x minus 7 plus 6, represented in a tree structure, which shows up a lot in evolutionary computation. Why would you want to evolve a mathematical equation? Data fitting. So there's a lot of research these days in saying I've got big complicated sets of data and I want to know how the data interrelates. I'll try and see if evolution can come up with an equation that predicts the data well. And so in fact there are some investment companies that do this sort of thing. They take historical stock market data and try and evolve equations that will predict what's going to happen in the future. There's a lot of work actually evolving computer programs. So you could say, I've got a population of computer programs, and I'm going to run each one of them, and most of them are going to do terribly, but if you will do a little less terribly, I'll select those. Evolving shapes or images, behaviors, and so forth. So again, the idea is I have some problem, I have a way to represent solutions to that problem, and now I'm going to put them into a population and allow those solutions to evolve. Make sense? Questions? So, a few examples. Oh, let me jump ahead into a few examples here. There we go. So, and most of these are actually different researchers at Beacon, in fact. So I sort of picked from that list. So there's a group that looks at robotic fish and actually do things like evolve the shapes of the fins and how they swim. Malware classifiers for sort of detecting malware on a computer. There are certain signatures that you can sometimes find, and so you can use an evolutionary technique to say, well, what are the best signatures? Images, so you can use evolution of images. I put this one up. This is an evolved beacon logo, so you notice it looks a little bit like a lighthouse, sort of a competition to evolve the logo. There's some researchers looking into optimizing land use. And several others, automotive design, already talked about there. And then one that I'll talk about that I've done some work with is robotic agent behaviors. So how to evolve behaviors to get robots here to behave better. Also a lot of interest in evolving cooperative behaviors, so to get agents to work well together. And I'll back up a little bit. So the idea from a computer perspective, or again, a computer scientist perspective of sort of the reproductive state is this notion of having a crossover operation and a mutation operation. And so you might have parents that are represented as tree structures. So this is pretty common to say I'm going to write an equation and break it out into a tree, or have a computer program represented as a tree, or even some designs are as trees, or it might be some solution encoded as a series of numbers, and then you would pick two above average individuals to be parents. I just sort of have them swarm, and there's our reproduction. And now the nice thing about tree structures, for example, is we have two new but valid trees. And so one of the things you have to worry about if you're trying to sort of do analogs of evolution in this way is, well, when I do reproduction, am I going to get something that's at all reasonable, that's syntactically correct, that this can help in that. And of course, mutation is just will become random change along the way. Good questions? Yep.
I'm curious, could you elaborate more on the images?
So the images are an interesting case. There's basically, again, a set of equations, actually, that sort of say, well, what color should each pixel be? And this is a program, and now I'm going to forget its name, which I feel terrible about, because you can find it on the web. PictReader, thank you. If you look up evolutionary art in Google, I think it's the first one that shows up. So what happens is there's a mathematical equation that basically sort of colors this in. And you get different equations, give you different images, but the question then becomes, well, what is the fitness function that you would apply? So what fitness function would you apply to art? Aesthetic. I mean, the only one really for art, I suppose, to some extent, is people. And so the way pick reader works is it gives you a set of usually 9 or 12 images, and you go in and select the ones you like. And then they get to reproduce. So it's a little less like natural evolution, a little more like sort of selective breeding. But the process is sort of the same.
Terry, I'll just interject.
Please.
The image at the bottom of the announcement in the program was one I created using PicRig.
wondered about that.
Yes, that's what, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, I meant to mention that, I forgot, so, yeah, excellent. So, right, so one of the interesting things is you can say, well, I'm gonna have sort of an external fitness function, or I'll use people. People have also done some work with evolving music this way, so it'll play different, a program will play different tones, and you get to pick the ones you like. Good. So the first sort of example I'm going to talk about is the Ladybug game, and this was developed sort of to illustrate evolution. And the idea behind it is to focus on sort of selection and inheritance and variation, the key components. And the way the game works, and game is more, it's sort of something you watch, but there is a game aspect to it, is there's a ladybug that runs around and tries to grab aphids. And it's actually the aphids that are undergoing evolution, and really there are only sort of a couple of rules that matter. The ladybug has a hard time seeing aphids that blend into the background. And if the ladybug catches one aphid, another aphid from the population gets to reproduce. So it's sort of a population with a constant carrying capacity of 20 in this case. And so I'll go ahead and click on the ladybug here and run the program. Yes, I actually want to run it. So this is a web page. This is the web page that I mentioned at the beginning. And so there's a little bit of an introduction to sort of the program, and then some, in a sense, simple experiments you can conduct by making these selections. But the basic idea, you go ahead and go here. Oops. Always happens. The one time you want something to work. Oh, there we go. Allow block content. Thank you. So there's actually two different environments so that you can sort of compare evolution side by side, and those are a little similar, so you can change the environments randomly. I'm going to see if I can get some, there's a green and orange, that looks a little better. And then I'll just hit scale on both of those. And so this is all that happens is the ladybug runs around and grabs aphids, and it's a little less likely to see ones that blend into the background. And then whenever the ladybug grabs an aphid, one of the other ones in the population splits. So like those two just split. And it doesn't generally take too long before you end up with over here fairly green looking aphids, and over here at least somewhat orange looking ones. Again, nothing special happening. Ladybug just runs around and grabs whatever it can see, and one of the other ones is randomly picked to reproduce. And there is a little bit of mutation. So you'll notice if you watch an aphid divide, the two colors are not necessarily identical. They vary a teeny bit. And if one is a little closer to the background, then it's a little less likely to be captured in it later. But very quickly, those two simple results drive the populations in very different colors. And you can do things, there are a bunch of buttons, but for example, you can hide the background, and then it becomes a little easier to see, oh yeah, these have become very green and these have become very orange. But the other sort of feature, I'll stop these for a moment, is there are little check boxes for variation, inheritance, and selection. And so you can simply turn those off and say, oh, on this side, I don't want any variation, any mutations anymore. And so we can run this as sort of a simple experiment. I'll reset the population. And then on this side, I'll say no more variation, which basically means I should be careful. There is initial variation, but when an aphid reproduces, it's a perfect clone, so there's no mutations. There is initial variation in the population, so there is some. And so now if we could go again, I have to wait a little bit, what you'll see over here with no mutational variation is you pretty quickly end up with a population that only has a few colors in it. And those colors are, of course, sort of have to remain fixed. So here we get a lot of greens, and they vary a little bit because of mutation, what you expect. And now I think we're down to 2 colors. Oh, now we're down to 1 color. And yes, they blend in fairly well because those were the ones that blended it best. But there's no variation, so they can't change from here. And it sort of, for an illustrative purposes, you can then go and say, I'm going to randomly change this environment, and I'm going to randomly change this environment. They both look sort of blue. This population, because you still get mutants, will eventually, although starting green, it's going to take a while, eventually they'll also end up being blue. And this population is stuck. No mutation, no evolution. And so that's sort of the point. This is, again, not a real sophisticated program, but it allows you to do sort of side-by-side comparisons. If I have variation, what happens if you have no variation? Well, evolution eventually grinds to a halt because there's nothing for it to work on. And you can do the same thing. You can turn off inheritance so that aphids don't inherit from their parents. And then again, you actually don't get any evolution because everybody is sort of completely random. They haven't inherited anything from their parents. Or you can turn off selection and sort of make the ladybug colorblind. Of course, if there's no selection because the ladybug is colorblind, you don't get any evolution. So it's a sort of very simple program, but it's a nice one for comparing or for the different pieces of evolution and showing how sort of necessary they are. Of course, these haven't changed, and those have gotten rid of the 2 of them, at least getting a little bit bluer. Yeah?
Will other of these populations ever get to a point of extinction?
No. So to sort of make it keep running, like I say, the carrying capacity is basically fixed at 20. So as soon as one aphid gets captured, another one immediately reproduces. Yeah.
Which means that the environment is not changing, everything they need is constant.
Right. Yeah. So this, yeah, there isn't like an actual, they're not eating any food in the background. Right. The only variable is whether or not they got grabbed by a ladybug. And so, thank you for the questions, because now we can see that they have something over it. Right. So again, it's a sort of a very short demonstration, but it's a nice way to allow probably talking more elementary school and middle school, but even as an introduction at the high school level to say, yeah, these are sort of the key features, and you can play with turning them on and off in the different environments. There's also a user control option over here, so if you click that, you actually use the mouse to drive the ladybug around, and you can sort of do breeding experiments and try and get nice yellow aphids if you want. Good. Questions? Yes?
Real quick, so can you adjust your variables for some selection, stuff like that with those upper controls?
No. So these are just
Or rate of mutation, stuff
change
like that?
those. So rate of
Just on and off.
mutation they're all fixed. Yep. And in fact, it would be pretty easy to put in like a mutational slider, but wasn't sure if it was worth the complications.
There's some other pretty simple simulators that I use for teaching purposes, and that's in there. But this is better. This scenario here is better than the other ones I use. But they do have that. You can select the mutation and the selector force both.
Okay. Excellent. So one thing actually, I'd be happy if people played with this. Well, that's the goal. It's on the web, so just go ahead and use it whenever. But if you have suggestions, send me an email. Sort of working on several different versions, some of which are simpler and some of which are more complicated. The one I really like to put in, which an earlier version had, you could select the background color. It was a little color wheel, and that makes it a little easier to control things. Yeah.
Are you able to make it where it mimics the different population, like directional versus, the different types of population growth?
So, not in this model, certainly, because here,
That would be great to see that model.
where you can see the size of the population change over time, absolutely. And that would be what I sort of be tempted to do is a separate version on a separate page, so that you could have a simple one and a more complicated one, but
Like stabilizing versus directional.
selection, exactly, yep, for sure. So like I said, this is the sort of thing that I like to do. This is for me fun writing programs. So other suggestions are definitely welcome. Good, other questions? Okay, so this is sort of one example, again, more for sort of educational purposes of evolutionary computation. And then talk a little bit on the research side. So this is one of the research projects that I'm sort of very involved in these days, which is evolved robotic behaviors. And in a sense, the very broad goal is to have robots that are easy to train. So robots presumably could be really useful, but you need a simple way to sort of show them what you want them to do. And the idea is to use evolution as sort of the training mechanism. And it should all take place on the robot. So people talk about onboard evolution. And we want to evolve behaviors, and the idea is to imitate the example. So we're going to show the robot what we want it to do, and then it will use an evolutionary mechanism to evolve the behaviors that imitate what we do, a term that sometimes gets used as learning by demonstration, or learning from demonstration. You see both of those. So here's the slide of the robots. I'm actually just going to grab one. I won't turn it on, but so this is one of our sample robots, and this is actually the brains part, which is just a smartphone. So put the phone in the front here, and then it uses the camera on the phone to navigate. So some nice advantages there. So like I say, very roughly, we have a brain which does sort of the evolution within the brain and makes the decisions, and that's for using smartphones, using a netbook or a tablet, and then there's sort of a body that moves it around, and we're using a little hobby platform. And then to get messages back and forth, we have a little microcontroller, and it really doesn't, the microcontroller here looks fancy, but it actually does almost nothing. It gets messages from the phone, turns the motors on and off. And a little background, so you'll sort of understand how all of this works, I hope, is, as I said, we use the phone's camera, so it takes an image, and then to simplify matters, it sort of breaks up that image, and for the current set of experiments, it basically labels each region, do I think this is likely to be the path or not? And so that we sort of pre-code, and right at the moment, the path is just a piece of red felt. And so red things are path, and non-red things are not path, and it actually breaks it into a grid of numbers, so you get some very small numbers for this is unlikely to be path, or high numbers, it's likely to be path. These numbers don't match that image, so don't try and line them up. But that's the idea. So this is sort of the input, and what the robot has to learn is, given this set of numbers, what in the world should I do? Right, so that's the behavioral question for the robot is, given that this was the image which is now turned into these numbers, what's my decision? And the way we do that can think of it as training. And so a person will drive the robot, usually just for a few minutes is all it takes. And we have a little training track. So it sort of go up, make a little turn, go a little further, turn around, come back. And the track is again sort of this red color. And what happens is, as the person is driving the robot, it's basically collecting image action pairs. So it collects a piece of data that says, when I see this sort of an image, I was told I should go forward. And so as the person's driving it, it's building up a set of these. And then what it wants to do is evolve behaviors that make the right decisions. Yes.
So is this an app?
So it actually, yes, it's an app.
And do you make it available to schools?
We haven't. We can, absolutely. It's not, unfortunately, real easy to use. It's not terribly hard to use, but if it's something you're interested in, we should definitely chat. Because right at the moment, we don't make it available. In part because you'd also have to go and build the robots, which only takes about 20 minutes from a kit. It's not quite as out of the box as I'd like. Yeah.
Does this idea work, let's say for someone who's colorblind and become their guide?
Potentially. I sort of prefer applications that are maybe a little less risky. It's not always right, and so I would hate, walk somebody out of the traffic because it mistook red for green. So there are some other applications we're looking at, but I mean, that's absolutely a possibility. Like I said, I get nervous when.
One more question
Sure.
on that aspect. Okay, so let's say right now you're programming it, it sees red and goes for it. So then if there's something close to the color red, has it started to evolve where that's close, it's okay, a possible variation off the trend?
Yes.
Like pink or?
Yep, absolutely. So what it really does is it sort of gives each square a number, and so a medium number, it can decide how to handle that. But how well it decides depends on how many examples you give it. So if you give it lots of examples that include some orange or some pink, then it's going to do better with those cases. I don't want to talk much about how it makes its decision. It uses an artificial neural network. If you're familiar with those, great. If not, that's okay. It's basically a computer scientist way oversimplification of how the brain works. So you thought my simplification of evolution was pretty simplified. Neural networks are way more oversimplified. But the basic idea is, given that we have this image with a bunch of values, we have to map them to should I go left or forward or right. And it goes through this network of calculations that in our case, because we have 40 inputs and 3 outputs, ends up meaning we need to sort of find about 250 values. So each of these lines gets a value associated with it. And so it's a matter of finding the right 250 numbers to apply here so that it makes the right decisions. And so that's what's evolving are these sets of numbers. So an individual is 450 values that, or excuse me, 250 values that when put into the neural network control how the robot moves. And if you have 250 really useless numbers, it won't drive very well. So as I say, we have to sort of evolve these values, and again, a very bad analogy, but you can sort of think of it as the DNA. It's just a list of numbers, and we want to sort of get the right values in those numbers through this evolutionary process. So that's the set of values, and then the robot itself maintains the population on board, and so it keeps going through and trying out different sets of numbers, and it actually happens while the person is driving. So if you're driving the robot for 5 minutes, showing it how to go, it almost immediately starts the evolutionary process. And so 5 minutes for us is not all that long, but sort of in computer time, we can generally do about 100 generations of these generational cycles. And what's sort of interesting about the process is you're driving it at the same time, so as you're driving it, you keep adding new and new pieces of data. And so the training set keeps growing sort of over the evolutionary history, if you will. And so there was a question sort of at the beginning of the day about evolution sort of versus learning. And if I wanted to be sort of very precise, and I'm not always, so I'll try to be at least for a minute here, what I would tend to say is that the behavior is evolving, right? Because it's the behaviors that are being selected, and the behaviors, so there's a whole population of behaviors on the phone, and in a sense, the robot is learning. So it's learning by running evolution, would be one way to look at it. I'm not sure that's the best, but yeah.
Not directly relevant to biology, but did you see video game developers doing a game that the characters evolve based on your decisions and mistakes and your choices in the game?
So that's the special topics course we're going to teach next year. Next semester, excuse me. I'm one of the faculty in biology at the University of Idaho wants to do that. And so in fact, what we're going to do, should keep an eye on the time here, is a tower defense type game. If you're familiar with those, the idea is you have a tower and sort of waves of attackers that are either trying to destroy your tower or steal your resources. And his idea, which I thought was a pretty clever one, was to say, well, each wave is sort of like a separate generation. So whichever attackers get closest to your tower or do the most damage get to reproduce into the next. So we've got, I think now 10 computer science majors and 10 biology majors signed up, and we're going to pair them off and have them implement different pieces. And it will either work fantastically or be a disaster because we can't get all our code to work together. But seemed like a worthwhile risk. So, yeah.
Will there eventually be a way for a robot to communicate with another robot? In other words, pass that information that is gained through you driving. Is there a way, in theory, for that information to be passed to a separate robot?
To a different robot?
To a different robot.
See, I should just have you in our lab. That is one of the things we're trying to do right now. So instead of one person driving one robot, we'll have 3 people driving 3 robots side by side, and then the robots share either their best behaviors or their training data back and forth. And so, for, I suppose, Star Trek fans, it's very Borg-like. Well, one robot learns, suddenly all the other ones have. But yeah, that's absolutely, and thinking about things like, so Robert Heckenhorn, who's my colleague, one of the things he wants, just because we have these nice little robots to do, is one that will go along and get rid of the dandelions in his yard. Right, little safety scissors and snip the dandelions. But it would probably take some work to train it to do that, so if you had 100 people who all bought them and took them out and trained them, and then they shared that information, it might only take a couple days to get a fantastic dandelion clipping robot. But yeah, absolutely.
And it's safe for the environment.
It's better than using chemicals and okay. So again, this is sort of just that model that I showed a minute ago, but the idea is now each of these represents a sort of a sequence of weights that are going to be tried out. And so rather than a lot of very precise data, what I have is a video. So this is a robot that basically went through this training process. So somebody drove it for about 5 minutes on this little short back and forth course to show it how to respond to different images. And then, oh, why did that not work? Here's what it does when we give it sort of, it's actually a trail with lots of different corners in it. So what you can see is it's learned quite well how to sort of make turns as it moves along. And one of the important things to realize is that a lot of these corners end up being a lot sharper than, say, what it was trained on. So it's generalized its behaviors a little bit. And then just to really sort of test it, something that it's never seen before, here, we'll pick it up and just sort of put it down in the middle of the carpet, and you can see it sort of turns around a little bit, and then finally said, oh, there's some red, I'm going to go quick jump on top of that. So it ends up being, and then now it's off on its way.
And would it continue randomly, or randomly sampling the environment until it found a path indefinitely, or until it ran out of power or whatever?
Oh, in that particular case,
Yeah.
yes. And I'm not sure how well it would, because it wasn't something we trained it to do, so it looked like it did a little bit of back and forth and then decided to go forward.
I wonder, because if it picked up the cue, but like if you had a great distance from a red path, would it finally settle down and go in a straight line until it hit red?
Probably not. I would guess that it would have just gone back and forth forever. Simply because we never really showed it what do you do when you don't see anything red. And so that wasn't a behavior that it had anything to learn from. So I'd be pretty sure, yeah, if you said there's no red anywhere around, it would just sort of turn back and forth. Yeah. Or something. It wouldn't come up with a clever search strategy. We didn't have enough information for that. So we've actually done this with some other environments. So that was sort of our in the lab, very controlled test case. We did some work. This is actually the University of Idaho's Arboretum, so an outdoor environment, and basically trained the robot to stay on the gravel path and stay off the green, just in a very short range, and then put it down. This is about a quarter mile, and it remained on the trail a whole quarter mile. The dots above it are GPS phones. So one of the advantages of using a phone is you can say, while you're driving, sample the GPS. And for reasons we don't understand, there was this definite offset. So for some reason, all of the samples said it was about 10 feet north of where it actually was. But you can see it mapped it very well.
Well, that's like a Google map or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's geocoded incorrectly.
Yep.
This would be great in agriculture, for example.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the things we actually just started to do is talk to some people in the college bag about, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the applications we're at least considering. Another one, actually, this is just a brick inlay in sort of the local park. And so we trained it to say, stay on the bricks, and you could watch it head around there. So a lot of different conditions. The ones outdoors, like, I didn't bring it with me, was not this robot. We have another one that's about the same size, but it's sort of an all-terrain vehicle. This wouldn't do so well on the gravel. So a couple different versions of the robots that can run around. And then, like I say, from here, oh, sorry.
Well, I just had one quick question about previously, ignoring the offset on your upper right image there.
Yep.
I can't help notice the pattern of lots and lots of samples all over the place, trailing down to a straight line. What's going on there?
That we're actually not sure about. It was just sampling the GPS a lot more frequently up here, and I don't know why. It was something that was causing it to sample more often and more noisy.
So it doesn't have anything to do with the path it charted?
No.
Okay.
So the width here basically gives you sort of the noise on the GPS. I think there are some trees and actually sort of ranges of hills around, so we weren't getting great GPS data.
Which way did it go?
It went this way.
That makes sense.
So towards the end, it was sampling less frequently, and I suspect that maybe that it didn't get a good lock, and so it was sampling more often. That was sort of the internals. One of the nice but frustrating things about using smartphones is there's a lot of built-in libraries. So the GPS, we just said, tell us the GPS coordinates. But in part what that means is that code is doing a whole bunch of things on its own, like oversampling because it's getting noisy results. And we don't have a lot of control over that.
Yeah.
Some other features of the phones that we've only started to use, they have accelerometers that know how tilted it is. So we could put in some, if you're tilting too much, stop. We've used the wireless so that they can communicate back and forth and share promising behaviors. So using the smartphones for the robot has been really nice for those sorts of features.
Is any kind of software like this being used with the rovers, say on Mars, for short-term control?
Yes, so my understanding is the Mars rovers, because the lag is so long, you can't remote control them. Really what they do, roughly speaking, is first thing in the morning they say, okay, I want you to go forward 5 meters today, and the rover is on its own to cover those 5 meters. Or they'll say, go over to this location, and it's on its own to do that.
Right.
Early on, it caused an interesting problem, is my understanding. One of the rovers moved forward and saw a big rock and said, I can't get past that rock, and so it backed away. And then it didn't see the rock anymore, and so it went forward. And it said there's a big rock in the way, and backed up. So they actually had to update a little bit of its pathfinding code.
So they are using some contingency software like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so a few of the projects that we're sort of building on this, one is Evolved Vision, and a lot of this was started at our partner institution at North Carolina A&T. And the idea here is, instead of using the whole image, to allow it to evolve which pieces of the image it's interested in. And so it takes us a fair amount of time to process the whole image, and for say pathfinding, probably everything in the top of the image is irrelevant. And so we could maybe just ignore that. And so one of the things we could do is put into sort of the genome, the DNA if you want, which parts of the image do you want to use? And also the ability to change the size of the region. So I want a big region in the middle to see if there's path there, and then a few little regions on the side to see if there's places to turn. And then now that we sort of have the basics working, we're looking at applications, and so some of them agricultural, put the robots out and have them look for weeds or invasive species or something like that. Certainly some applications in search and rescue. And again, a nice thing there is we can leverage existing code. So all of our phones now are really good. If you go to take a picture, at least the new ones, draw little boxes around everybody's face because they're great at facial recognition. Well, we can borrow that code and it would help a lot in search and rescue. And we have the advantage that if you find somebody, not only have you found them, you've also given them a phone so they can call for help.
That's awesome.
Applications for things like surveying and so forth. So now that we have the basics, we're pretty comfortable that they work. We're looking at sort of what are the applications we can do. So to wrap things up, lots of acknowledgments. So in terms of from the start of we don't even know what kind of robot we want to use, to designing that and working our way up to actually doing the research has been a whole bunch of work by graduate students and undergraduates. Dr. Robert Heckenhorn is another member of the computer science department, sort of my colleague in all of this. Of course, I have to give credit to the National Science Foundation for funding it. I guess if there's a takeaway message, it's this notion that evolution, or to stick with Beacon's message, evolution in action can be applied to a huge variety of problems, right? If you have some complicated problem, but you say, I have a way of representing potential solutions. I have some way of putting a potential solution on the computer, and then I have some way of measuring the fitness of potential solutions. So I have a representation and a fitness function, then you can apply an evolutionary model to it and see what happens. Okay? Thank you.
Questions? Time for a couple?
They've covered.
So I have a question actually.
Sure.
You talked about training the robots to essentially see red and follow red, but on the gravel path, how did that work? Is it just the image of gravel can be recognized similar to a color, or was there some other strategy?
Right, so for the gravel path, what we actually did was we started by taking basically pictures of the gravel and then having it generate a color histogram. So how much gray, how much brown, how much black. And then each region in the image was compared to those histograms to say, is this probably gravel or probably not?
Okay, so it's not strictly color, it can be sort of a
It
composite.
can be other things. And in fact, we're trying to sort of loosen up those rules so that the next iteration, we're going to give it 3 maps, one of red, one of blue, one of green, and it will have to sort of learn on its own or evolve, I should say, the right behaviors, evolve to either pay attention to one of those colors or some combination. Right now, we're sort of pre-keying it. Pay attention to red or pay attention to gravel. And moving away from that would make it much more flexible. Yep.
My question is about the energy source that you're using, and in my mind, when I think evolution, right, you have to deal with energy in the sense that it's an underlying driving force. And so I'm wondering if how long the robots are running for now, and if you could foresee in the future a way for them to either charge themselves using light or, in theory, even plug themselves in.
Right. So that's actually a good question. And there's a lot of groups, other groups that do evolutionary robotics, and a lot of them have started from that sort of standpoint. Again, going back to Dr. Pennick's talk with the phototaxis robots, if they had a little solar panel, then suddenly that becomes not only an interesting behavior, but a critical one.
Right.
So for us, I can pull it out here.
Can you have can you run the robot a little bit? Is it possible for you to run the robot for?
Yeah, I can do that in just a minute. I'll turn it on.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So we're just running off a battery pack, and the phone has its own battery. But what's interesting is you can buy solar panels for phones, right, to take camping. And so we've sort of thought about buying some of those and plugging them in, and then, yeah, all of a sudden it might want to evolve to find the brightest sunlight on its own. Doing that to run the motors would be a little trickier. I think it would be a pretty big solar panel to keep them going. But that's definitely one thing we'd like to look into.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have a huge amount of interest from students, computer science students who are fascinated by genetic algorithms? Do you have a lot? Or is it something new to them that they're not familiar with?
So that's an interesting question. Certainly not familiar to a lot of them. Most of them get excited fairly quickly, although not as much as I'd expect, but that's because I'm really biased. I think that's great. So, for example, we also have a view of a really good program in computer security. And so that certainly grabs a lot of students' attention just as much.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, maybe you're willing to go out in the hall after we're done with all this and let people play. But
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's really cool because I was playing with it earlier. But Luke, I don't know if you have any closing comments. I just wanted to say I want to thank all of you for attending and thank all four of our speakers for absolutely terrific talks.